Welcome back. I wanted to go over IPS, introduction of that today. So we're going to go over the names of the components of the IPS unit. So from the top we have the Zeus unit, steering unit servo, which really is a microprocessor and an electric motor. So what you have here is you have your power supply. You have a lot of amperage to run that electric motor. You have what is the plug connection that goes down to what's called the resolver, which is monitoring the position of the drive. So this unit is very easy to remove. You just undo the connection, and there's 2 bolts, and you undo your power cables, and the unit would come out underneath that. On the bottom of the Zeus unit is a small gear. This would be on the end of the shaft, okay? And that gear will interface in with the double planetary transmission. So there's 2 sets of planetary gears down inside what that gear fits into. And what that does is it allows this electric motor to spin at a very high rotational quantity or distance. And we'll just do revolutions. So for every 1,007 revolutions, it drives that gear 1 rotation. So basically this motor spins very, very rapidly, and through a gear reduction, through that planetary gear reduction, you've got all the torque you need to turn the drive while it's underway. The second part really is the actual transmission port. So this is the transmission that is receiving the input drive shaft from the back of the engine. So you would have a tail shaft bolted up to the end of the propeller. You'll have a short drive shaft. You'll have a plastic cover over it that's a plastic guard. Different boats can have different length drive shafts. There's a coupling that goes onto the end of it that receives the drive shaft. You unbolt that and slide the drive shaft back, and then you can take the coupling off. In preparation for remove it, you have to do that, obviously. Take your power supply cables off, and any other harness sensors to take it off. On the back, we have our exhaust outlet. On the front, there are 2 inlets for water that are coming up from the drive up to the engine. On the transmission itself, as you'll see on the top cover, you have the fill plug here. There is a filter on the other side. I'll show you that in a minute. You have your 2 shift solenoids here. So your forward and your reverse gear solenoids. You have your transmission temperature and pressure sensor here. And this bolts right on top of the intermediate housing. So the transmission is the top, or the reverse gear if you want to call it that. You have your Zeus unit, you have your intermediate housing, and then what we have is to hold that intermediate housing onto the actual boat. There is a plate underneath which is attached to the intermediate housing, and basically that has a large O-ring like this that sandwiches in between the hull. So this top clamping ring fits right over the top of this. You'd have to have the exhaust piece taken off. You slide that over the top of it when you're bolting it in place. When we want to remove it, what we're going to do is we're going to undo the bolts on the clamping ring, and it will tell you that in the service manual, that you equally loosen these in the pattern that you tighten it up. Each area of the major bolt holes, the 4 that you pull the drive up with as you're winching it up in place, are numbered. There also is the torque spec here. So there's really only 4 bolts when we're getting the drive up into place, and when we snug those up, then we can put the rest of the bolts in. Those bolts take a special sealer, which should be applied underneath the bolt head where it receives the surface. Gives it lubrication so you get the right torque angle, and also the sealer goes on the threads, so if any moisture goes down inside there, it doesn't go all up between the threads and the bronze housing. All the bolts are steel painted, hardened bolts. Underneath, obviously, you have the lower unit, forward-facing propellers. So in the inside of the drive itself is a large silicon bronze receiver, and that fits through this steel ring. And this sits right on top of the intermediate housing, and the lower unit shaft comes up through it, and then there's a ring that goes over it, and that bolts that into the whole lower unit. On the top of the bronze shaft that comes out of the lower unit, there's a ring, there's a cut they put into the housing itself. And that is actually closer to the lower unit than it is up inside the boat. So the reason that they put a cut relief in there is it's a shear point. So if you are operating the boat and you hit a submerged hard object like a rock and you're going fast enough, then the design of the system is to shear the lower unit off and allow the unit to break away, but leaving the upper portion of that shaft bolted with this ring inside with a large seal on it. So there's a large seal, about that big, that seals the water out, and that will be intact when the lower unit breaks away. This way the boat doesn't sink. Let's go over the rest of the components, and I'll just spin this around so you can kind of see it a little bit. I'll look back to the video, make sure that we're in the right position. Looks pretty good. Okay, so on this side, all right, again, you have your clamping ring here. You got your 2 O-rings. You have your intermediate, the bronze housing here. You have your transmission, which is bolted in place. You have your exhaust. On the back of it is the actual oil level dipstick. So there's your oil level dipstick back here. You also, for IPS-D, IPS-A was the first generation, B, C, D. Introduction to D came with the speed sensor. So that was an upfit into the drive itself, and there is a resolve. Let's go back, take this piece out. So on IPS-D, they introduced the speed sensor. IPS-A was the first, just basic steering. IPS-B got the joystick. IPS-C, some upfit in components to make them stronger. IPS-D was the Try it again. The introduction of the speed sensor was in IPS-D. So if I go back to IPS-A, that was the first generation, looked just like this. It just had electronic steering. IPS-B, the second generation, came out with joystick steering. IPS-C, there was some updates and strengthening of components. IPS-D got the speed sensor. So the speed sensor, or reluctor, is actually the speed of the transmission. So you have your input gear, then you have your upper and lower gear, which are much like a DPS drive, except there's clutches inside this, forward clutches and reverse clutches. So when you start the engine up, top gear spins, the pinion gear spins, and the lower gear spins. They're not engaged to the lower drive shaft until you shift into gear. And those are electronically solenoid actuated. So that reluctor is rotating, and it is telling the speed of the actual transmission. So when we wanted to go to what is known as sport fish mode or slow mode, there's on the control panel for IPS, you're allowed to push a button, and basically what that will do is slip the transmission. So it will hydraulically pulse the clutch packs, which will slow the transmission down. So if you want to do sport fish mode, you want to slow the boat down to troll, or you're coming into the dock and you want to slow the boat down because some of the boats are reasonably light and they go real fast, you will also have a second lever for your control, which would be your slip lever. So if you pull that slip lever back, then the transmission basically slips to almost zero. If you push it all the way forward, then it's just like shifting into gear. So that's a new component that's added to the system in IPS-D. The other piece I wanted to show you was your oil filter would go here, you have a pressure sensor here, or a pressure valve inside the transmission, and that is then the front of the gear. Check that picture again. That's fine. This is the hydraulic pump. So on the front of the gear assembly, if I take these 4 bolts off, this is where your actual hydraulic pump is. So the hydraulic pump is driven by the input shaft. Then that oil pressure that's created inside that hydraulic pump goes over to your shift solenoids. When you want to engage it into gear, basically what you're going to do is shift it in gear. You send a request from the HCU down to the PCU, and in between the PCU there's a breakout harness or a T harness, and that comes into the IPS unit. So underneath here on the other side is another 6-pin Deutz connector where your X2 data link cable breaks off and goes into the IPS unit. It receives the shift command from the HCU, and then it will energize the correct solenoid, which will allow that hydraulic pressure to compress the clutch pack, and that will shift the drive into gear. I think that's a good introduction to it, and we'll go over some more of the internal details of it in later videos.